Welcome to Cartoonist Kayfabe. My name is Jim Rugg.
I'm Ed Piscor.
I'm very excited for our guest today. He has a new book out, The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Cartoonist. I have been reading his work for years. He started self-publishing Optic Nerve when he was still in high school, moved on to Drawn and Quarterly, and has been publishing Optic Nerve comics and graphic novels for the past 25 years. Welcome to Cartoonist Kayfabe, Adrian Tomina.
Hey guys, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here finally after watching you guys, and now I get to be a part of it.
Congratulations on the new book, Adrian.
Thank you, Ed.
Thankfully, Drawn and Quarterly sent us an advanced PDF that we were able to get through. And one of the things that really struck me was just the sheer tightness of the writing. And I would say the first half of the book, up to the Summer Blonde portion, I would say the tightness of the writing struck me as like being like tried and true, road tested material, probably stories that you've told over dinners with your friends time and time again, because it's just every syllable is perfect. And I do wonder if that is the case.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. It's sort of everything's been all my friends and family members have been unwittingly workshopping these stories with me over the years, and I have many times been edited in real time by my wife as I'm telling them. So I've sort of taken her notes into account when I put the stories down on paper. She still wishes she could jump in and clarify things or give her point of view, especially about a few of the ones that she features in. But yeah, you're right. It wasn't like the first time I told any of those stories.
Well, this is we talk a lot about craft on this show, and one of the first probably interviews or something I read about you, it involved taking creative writing classes. When you were still a young cartoonist but producing comics. I wonder about those creative writing classes. So much of our focus is on art. We don't always get to talk to people who have worked formally on their writing craft. Can you talk about that experience and if there are still tools you use in your writing process from those classes?
Well, actually, the classes that I think you're talking about were when I was in college at Berkeley. And at least at the time, there actually wasn't a creative writing program. So I was an English major, and I had to do a lot of writing, but it was all criticism and analysis. So it was just a barrage of read these classics, read these books, every week and turn in your papers about them. So it was, kind of the antithesis of creative writing in a lot of ways. But it did force me to read a lot of big books that I would have been afraid of otherwise. And aside from that, if I've taken anything with me, I think it's just that objective critical eye, which, at the time I was supposed to apply to, Moby Dick or something like that. And now I feel like I've kept that with me. And I, as much as, humanly possible, I try to apply to my own work, and I try and be a pretty tough critic on my own stuff.
One of the things that grabbed me in The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Cartoonist is the opening couple of pages where we see young Adrian at school professing his love for comics.
I figured some of those titles would jump out at you.
They do very much. And when I started reading your work, there was a real divide between what we call mainstream comics, which is superhero comics here in America, and alternative comics. And you were clearly in that alternative camp. Yeah. And you start self-publishing, I think, when you're about 16, somewhere at that age. Mm-hmm. What's the transition from, being a Spider-Man fan to getting into alternative comics at what I think of as a relatively young age?
I guess so. Yeah. I mean, I think I should preface all this conversation with explaining that, like you said, that there was more of a divide back when we were younger. And I feel like now, I think partially due to guys like you, that a lot of those walls have been broken down, and a young comics fan now could just as easily be as much of a manga fan and a Marvel fan and underground fan. I think that's a big change that's happened. So the era that we're talking about, it was almost like choosing sides. You had either left that world behind or you were still in it, or and so for me, it wasn't exactly like one day I was a superhero fan, and then the next day I was an underground comics fan. There was a transitional period in between where I was not a fan at all, but I was a collector. And I've described it as being like the most depressing version of being a comics fan, where the joy of reading the material had completely left me, but the ritual of it was still deeply embedded in me. So every week I would go to the comic book store, and I wouldn't even bother to browse around. The person behind the counter would have my pull list, and they would just hand me a brown paper bag, and I'd hand them money, and I'd go home and I would sort of flip through like, all right, here's another Moon Knight issue, and okay. And then I would get a little more excited because I'd put it in the plastic sleeve in the board and alphabetize it. I see the boxes right behind you there. It's bringing back memories. And at a certain point, it was more of a kind of a realization that I was wasting money in a way, because I was spending quite a bit of money on buying these comics and also on the bags and boards and all that, and kind of skipping the part of reading the comic. So I had about a year of that, and finally I had some sort of moment of like, I think I knew in my heart that I still loved comics, but I wanted to find some other kinds of stories. So fortunately, the store that I went to had a little alcove in the back of the store, that I was always afraid of, but I kind of decided. I remember riding my bike over there, like, all right, this is the week that I'm gonna turn that corner and go into that part of the store, and fortunately, there were a few things that sort of were like transitional comics. Like, I think right now people think of Love and Rockets as being kind of like the ultimate indie alternative comic, but for me, as someone who'd grown up, as I put in the book, being a fan of John Romita and guys like that, I looked at especially Jaime's artwork and I was like, oh, okay, I see some connection here. I bet he was a fan of some of the stuff that I was when I was growing up, but he's telling these different kinds of stories. And same with Gilbert. I was looking at some of the things. I was like, this kind of reminds me of Kirby a little bit. And so I was seeing some vestiges of that other world, but in the pursuit of something different. And that really excited me. And I think that was the main kind of gateway drug for me was Love and Rockets.
Are you drawing comics at a young age?
Yeah.
How old are you when you're making this transition that you describe?
Like middle school. So I guess I was probably 12, 13, something like that.
Are you making comics at that time?
Yeah, definitely. Before that, for sure. I mean, I was making, basically my whole life, I've been making a version, like kind of a imitative, lesser version of the kind of things that I was a fan of. So I've got boxes full of fake superhero comics, usually just the cover, like I would spend all this time doing the cover and designing a logo and things like that, trying to emulate the price and the Comics Code Authority symbol and everything, and then running out of steam and never never executing the comic. And so I had a few characters. I've talked to other friends of mine, and we all had our own cast of weird superheroes that kind of unintentionally reveal some psychology about our childhood or something. I had a character named the Sentinel, and his power was that he just watched things really well. He was like a creepy voyeur, basically. I know another cartoonist whose childhood character was called the Whip, and he was like a guy with a mustache and a whip. And so I did a lot of that kind of stuff. I did science fiction comics. I did sort of like knockoffs of like dystopian science fiction, like Blade Runner kind of things. But they were all just on like 8.5 by 11 typing paper. Like I was not getting professional art supplies, and I wasn't drawing anything with reproduction of the artwork in mind. It was just a lot of like pencil and marker on typing paper. And so that just continued. So when I started falling in love with Love and Rockets and Raw and Peter Bagg and all those people, I started kind of doing imitative comics of that kind of work. And especially Harvey Pekar, I started doing kind of like my own versions of like, well, I got a flat tire and I had to change it and I hurt my back or something like that, because I was so, inspired by that kind of new slice of life writing. So yeah, all along there's you know, there's no period of my life where I can remember not doing some type of cartooning.
It's interesting to hear you describing the slice of life stuff. It reminds me of comedians that you'll hear started very young, and you think like, what's a 16-year-old have to say on stage?
Yeah, jerking off and taking a shit. Is
Yeah,
like
exactly.
The things they have to talk about in their young life.
Yeah, yeah. Well, not only was my life very limited, but I was also inhibited. I wasn't like an underground cartoonist in San Francisco in the 60s. I was like, well, my mom might read this comic, so let me think. What's a story that I could tell that won't offend her?
When you were 16, as the book alleges, you were interested in pursuing getting a series with Drawn and Quarterly. So around that time, like what was out? Was Palookaville out? Was it just the anthology?
The anthology and sort of the first group of solo books had started coming out. So they'd taken over the publication of Yummy Fur. They had Peep Show, Palookaville, and Dirty Plot. So in my mind, that always feels kind of like the core founders of the Drawn and Quarterly world. And I was a big fan of all of those artists and and the anthology, but really it was sort of like that feeling of here's a little publishing company and whatever they put out, whatever has their name on it, I'm going to want to check out and I'm probably going to like. And so that was why I was really, I had sort of this ambition of trying to weasel my way into that crew.
When you start doing Optic Nerve, the mini comics, the self-publishing, is there a scene? Like, how do you get into that mode? And I asked that because when I started making comics, I offset printed 2,000 of the worst comics you've ever seen because I didn't know any better. And then I went to SPX and I saw all of these mini comics, and that became my model for a couple of years. A much more feasible way to make comics early on. Was there a pathway for you? Did you know other cartoonists, or was there a community?
Well, I'm just curious how it was that it was more feasible and accessible for you to do offset printing rather than Xerox or something.
The small press co-op was like a big thing, and where would you have seen it? Like was it in the Comics Journal?
Somewhere. It was one of these printing companies had an ad somewhere. I had no idea what to do, and it was like, okay, you can make comics this way.
And what they would do is like you would pay your fee, and then they would kind of gang print 10 different people's books so that it made your offset costs so cheap, and then they would have the chart. So it's like, okay, 1,000 of these things are $2,000, but 2,000 of them are $1,200 or so. So it's like, well, I'll get 60,000 copies.
The profit margin will be insane.
Yes,
if I sell all of them.
Right.
And do you remember anybody else who you might have been ganged up with, or who else was doing that?
I do, as a matter of fact. My first issue came back, and it was kind of packed loosely with like other print jobs, bunched up paper to protect them.
Yeah.
And I believe it was Kramer's Ergo #1, Sammy Harcum.
Oh my
comics.
God, really?
Yeah. So it was
interesting.
It must have been late '99, early 2000, somewhere around that time frame. But
amazing. Again,
not the best way to do it. Anyone watching at home that wants to try print comics, start with the Xerox comics. Make 20 of them.
Yeah. Well, to answer your question, I had zero like community. Like I was living in Sacramento, California. Obviously living at home, going to high school in a very kind of mainstream suburban, very white, very college-oriented high school. So there wasn't like a group of weirdos that were also into comics that I was friends with. So I had sort of like my normal life, and then I would just go home and make comics on my own. And obviously pre-internet too, which would have been such a game changer for me. But what I did is I started, it was all through the mail. Like I would see someone like Chester would recommend a mini comic, and so I would put cash in an envelope and send it off, and then something would come back to me. And so that was really my introduction to mini comics. I think I got some of the last Dirty Plot mini comics before Julie switched over to Drawn and Quarterly. there was a guy named Terry Laban, who you guys might remember, but he was kind of a big deal in the world of mini comics at that time. He had a thing called Unsupervised Existence that I sent away for, and we kind of started up a correspondence. He was very encouraging to me. I'm trying to think. There were so many people who have now gone on to become professionals. I remember getting mini comics from Matt Madden. There was, oh God, there were so many. But that was like this whole little community that I plugged into by mail, and I literally would sort of like look at physically, like, how did they do this? Okay, so it looks like it's one piece of paper that's been cut in half and then folded, and I just kind of had to figure it out myself. And I also think that even back then that Kinko's was not that. I think now you could just take the files to them and they'll make a booklet for you. But like, I was really doing it myself, like making the masters with paste ups and trying to get them on the machine and print them out, and then getting home and then realizing that my stapler wasn't long enough to reach the middle of the fold, and a lot of rookie errors for sure.
Yeah, that era is just a little bit before I was really collecting that mail order exchange. But I've gotten to know some of the people that you've named, so I'm aware of it. And like you said, you would see it in letters columns and things like Yummy Fur. So I would see references to it, but it's just a little bit before I was engaging with it.
Yeah.
So it's great to hear an account of that. John Porcelino, another Drawn and Quarterly artist,
perfect example. Yeah.
Would often, I think, participate in that. I think he would get dirty plots and stuff. I've heard him say. There would be like collections like Fact Sheet 5 that would have I guess addresses and things that you could order comics, share comics. Maybe they would review them in a little blurb kind of thing.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Ed.
Was the Ape convention going on in San Jose when?
Not yet.
No.
Okay,
so it's before
no. This was I'm talking about when I was a teenager. So this was probably like 89, 90, something like that. And I was still pretty isolated in Sacramento.
You weren't hanging out with Sam Keith in Sacramento while he was...
No, I knew who... I knew who he was. The two big shots in Sacramento at the time were Sam Keith and... I don't know if this will ring a bell with you, but there was a guy named Ron Lim who went on to do a bunch of image stuff eventually. But at the time, he was kind of a like, I think he did a big mural inside the Comics and Comics in one of their locations in Sacramento.
Did you know Silver Wolf Comics? Chris Silver published these black and white indie comics. Like I think Tim Vigil's around Sacramento, right?
Yeah, I was going to say Tim Vigil was there too. Yeah.
And so Silver Wolf must have been out of Sacramento area, because Ron Lim, I think his first published work might have been.
Oh yeah, that's right. Really? The Eradicators. That's right.
Yeah, it's a very questionable publisher, but they published like 60 or 70 books over several years, and I don't know. That's a whole another story.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, so even if you look around at who the names were in the cartooning world in Sacramento at the time, like I was pretty, out of place. Like if I had been an aspiring Faust kind of artist or something like that, I would have sought out Tim Vigil. But the one kind of turning point for me was so around that time I got a weird job doing these little comic strips, kind of like advertisements inside a free magazine that Tower Records gave out. Their offices, they were located in Sacramento, and one of the editors for their promotional magazine happened to see my mini comics. So he gave me this job doing these comic strips in their magazine, which was called Pulse, which was amazing. It was like my first job as a cartoonist. But in addition to that, he also introduced me to Carol Tyler and Justin Green, who it turned out literally lived around the corner from my mom's house in Sacramento. And so I got in touch with them, and they invited me over to their house. And that was just kind of a eye-opening experience. It just burned into my memory, the idea of like going to a professional cartoonist's house for the first time, and a cartooning couple, a married couple with a kid, and yeah, I mean that was like kind of like the first feeling of connection I had to this world that used to just be in print and separate from me. And I was like, oh, okay. So I know these people's work and they live around the corner from me. That was amazing to me.
Did you participate in like San Diego Comic-Con or any of the conventions? Was that a
Not
pathway?
yet. Not yet. But I did go to really grim local conventions when I was a kid. First in Fresno, California, and then in Sacramento. And a lot of times they were just in like a church lobby or something like that, or if they were really fancy, they might be in a hotel ballroom or something like that. But very, very small time, and totally just dealers selling stuff. There was no like celebrity signings or anything like that. But I didn't start going to San Diego until, I think I'd already moved to Berkeley. So I think that was sometime after 1993 or 94 that I started going to San Diego. And then amazingly, I had, I think something like a 13-year consecutive run of going to San Diego every summer. And now I haven't been in ages. This was supposed to have been the first year I went back after a long hiatus.
You were spared, man. The only good thing to come from COVID.
Well, I'm happy because as I'm on record as accepting the invitation, and I was planning on being there, and then everything got canceled. So I feel like I was in theory I was a guest there this year.
One other, man, you make comics at there's such interesting milestones that are happening concurrently with you making comics. I know your comics aren't at all like the Image model, but it seems like you're starting to self-publish around that time period.
Yeah.
How are you related to that?
Image also weirdly ended up, they're in Berkeley, right? I mean, it is odd that I thought of them for a long time as like an equivalent to like Marvel and DC, which I always thought of like as being in some skyscraper in Manhattan or something. And then now I just that Image is an office in Berkeley is really strange to me. I mean, I by that time I was kind of defiantly indie, like I was like really immersed in that world. And like I said, there was a lot more of a us versus them kind of mentality back then. And so, I was not really following what was going on with Image at the time. I was aware of it, but not as a reader.
You were following the Ninja Turtle path into alternative comics. You mentioned I think 1994 is when you receive a Xeric grant.
Yeah, I actually own an original from one of the first issues of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Like the actual Eastman and Laird artwork with that craft tint stuff on it.
Wow.
So I was happy when I won that Xeric award that I could actually say, hey, I actually have this artwork from you guys. Sorry to interrupt. I was just.
Well, I'm interested, I'm interested just in this path because you start self-publishing, then you get a Xeric award, which is an amazing list of the people that have received that over the years. A really interesting kind of collection of cartoonists, but that seems like a huge deal, for a young cartoonist to get that. It seems like a real positive step, and you do accelerate pretty quickly. Those first few years going from self-publishing to D&Q, I think it's only 4 or 5 years in total with the Xeric there in the middle. I wonder if you remember anything from that experience. Did that further your network? Like, were you then connected to the other Xeric winners?
Yeah, I think they did a nice job of. I think they told previous winners that part of your obligation is you might have to be in touch with the next round of applicants, and you might want to give them some advice or something like that. Somehow along the process, I did get in touch with people like Jason Lutz and Megan Kelso, a bunch of people who were all up in Seattle at the time. And so somehow the grant or the process of applying for that grant put me in touch with them, and we developed a nice friendship through that.
Adrian, what was the circulation of the self-published comics? Would it reach into the thousands?
Eventually. I mean, the circulation of the very first issue of Optic Nerve, the first printing, was 25. I mean, I just did a few just to give to my family members, basically. But by the time I did that last mini comic with the help of the Zurich Foundation, I believe it was 7,000. Yeah, I mean, I've still got a few boxes of them sitting in a garage somewhere, but I think I did about 7,000 on that one.
I think that's higher than the average Vertigo book at the end of their run.
It's amazing.
It's always fascinating too, like how, like, I'm sure you go on eBay and those comics that you have boxes of are going for a pretty penny. And it seems that like every cartoonist has their own kind of De Beers Diamonds
Right.
archive of like their old stuff. I would go to Harv's house and he would just have boxes and boxes of American Splendor 1, and he would actually like peel out copies and use them as wampum when he would travel the country and sell them to a comic shop for gas money and stuff.
Yeah, no, I know, it's true. I think there was a time when the Hernandez brothers still had copies of the original self-published Love and Rockets, and I mean, I've had a lot of experiences of corresponding with a cartoonist, an older, more established cartoonist, and then they send me back a little package, and it'll be some amazing like underground comic that I've never even actually seen in person, but they probably just are trying to clear out some space in their apartment or something.
That's amazing. Well, I have two directions we could go here. One is about format. So, as a self-publisher, the reason I mention it is because your new book is such an interesting format and you seem so in tune with the physical object.
Yeah.
Does that come from your self-publishing background, do you think?
Partially, I think, unfortunately for my friends at Drawn and Quarterly, that the self-publishing background turned me into a total control freak about making comics. Like, because everything was up to me for so many years, from creating the content to handling the production and the distribution, that I just got used to being that hands-on and caring that much. I mean, I know some cartoonists who don't even care about design. They sort of feel like, I'll send you the guts and you guys make the cover and package it however you want. And, I'm not interested in that kind of stuff. But for me, everything was of equal importance, from the typeface for the indicia to the paper stock and even going back to the self-publishing days of like driving around to try and find a Xerox machine that would do a full bleed or something that approximated that, or and just the other teenagers behind the counter looking at me like I'm insane because I'm pointing out this 1/8 inch white border around the cover or something like that. So that's unfortunately sort of carried over, even though I'm now working for like the most competent and incredible production team in the world. But it's also like sort of, I had this realization that for a while I was one of those like bibliophiles who was always in interviews trying to make the case for like, well, comics are meant to be read on paper, and I'm into ink and paper and not pixels, and all this kind of old fogey talk. And then I started to feel like, well, I've seen what some of these things look like now on an iPad or whatever, and in some cases they look better. And so I felt like I need to start doing what I can to make the case for print. That's still what I prefer, and I still want to support bookstores and comic stores, and I want my work to be read that way as much as possible. But I felt some obligation to like give consumers a reason to do that instead of just clicking a button and getting it instantly on their screen. So especially with this one and a little bit with Killing and Dying, I wanted to come up with a design that would catch someone's eye at a bookstore, that would look different from the other books around it. And in this case, with the new book, I wanted to even see if I could find a way to make the object itself be kind of part of the story, to make it tie into the content, so that it's almost an incomplete reading experience if you don't have the actual book.
And we should describe that for listeners at home. It takes on the form of a journal, like the Moleskine journals, for instance. Right. Which matches up the material very well as this like intimate diary journal, personal inside story. So it's an interesting match of format and content.
And even the way Adrian handles the art, he's not using like the traditional brush that he would use. It's
Right.
like the more immediate implements that you would use in a travel journal or something.
Yeah, I mean, I knew I wanted to draw the book in that way, and I think there was also a little insecure part of me that I thought, okay, if I do it in this format, it'll instantly telegraph to readers that I drew it that way on purpose. That I'm not just like declining in my old age or something like that, but that it's all for a reason. That it's supposed to look like a sketchbook, you know.
Can we jump back for a second? Because I
Yeah,
want to take it back to the '90s and just sort of
back to the '90s.
just sort of knowing the margins on what one makes on a comic. How does an independent cartoonist survive in the '90s? Is selling the original art a big part of it? Illustration gigs?
Yeah, all of that. I mean, a part of that era, part of the '90s, still overlapped with me being a college student. So I was basically going to school full time, and the pressure to make a living off the comics was less. So, and then during the summers between the years of college, I would work some kind of minimum wage job or something like that, and then still continue to make comics in my spare time. Um, During that period, I worked as like a dishwasher and a prep cook, and I drove a delivery van for a Xerox shop, which allowed me to make my comics when no one was looking. Um, and then by the time I graduated from college, I mean, by that time I'd signed up with Drawn and Quarterly, but that's not, contrary to what all my friends at the time thought, it was not at all like a life-changing financial thing at all. I mean, it took the burden off me from having to pay for the production, but it wasn't like a sustaining income. So selling art, yeah, was a part of it. I remember selling, I mean, it kills me to think of it now, but I remember going to a convention in San Mateo that Lee's Comics had put on. And I was so excited because I sold the original to the first Drawn and Quarterly Optic Nerve cover for $100. And I remember thinking like, wow, I got $100 for that. And most importantly, I had, during that time in college, started building a parallel career in illustration. And that was really what sustained me for a while, was doing a lot of well-paid but horrible assignments for ad agencies and things like that. A lot of it nobody's ever seen, but it was just, like to think that like you could spend 6 months working on a comic and get a few pennies or something, or you could spend a week drawing some stupid, fashion ad or something like that and get thousands and thousands of dollars. Was hard to resist, even though I hated the work very much.
Do you feel like doing that illustration work was a benefit in terms of developing your illustration skills, your drawing skills?
Yeah, I mean, that era, what I feel like it was useful for was that it taught me that sometimes it's better to say no to a job if you start getting a vibe that it's going to be a nightmare. At the time, I just thought like, I just always got to say yes, and I need the money, and I got to take everything I can get. And that led to a lot of nightmare scenarios. It also just gave me a new perspective on working in a collaborative way. And even if I was in a situation where I didn't really like the art director, or I wasn't a fan of the thing that I was trying to promote, it taught me that there was some like necessary human interaction skills of like, or even sometimes kind of like playing a chess game a little bit, like holding your tongue strategically, or doing a fake sketch that that they're not really going to like, and then at the last minute submitting the one that you really want them to take, or a lot of these mind game kind of things. But mostly just about like it was a good humbling experience in a way, because like I said, I self-published, and then I was picked up by Drawn and Quarterly, who kind of let me continue to do whatever I wanted to do. I mean, Chris Oliveros famously used to say, "I look forward to reading your new issue when it comes back from the printer." And then, so to sort of learn how to deal with bosses and committees and editors and all those things were things that have definitely served me well later on.
And we should say, you continue to do great illustration to this day. Like you've done a lot of work with the New Yorker and Francois Mollet, art director there. I feel like we're jumping all over in terms of time, but these are interesting threads. You know, as a comics fan, obviously she's connected to Raw Magazine in the past, which was paradigm changing for comics, I think.
Yeah.
You know, so having that illustration background probably sets you up to be where you are today in terms of doing what I assume are a little better illustration jobs, more rewarding, I would assume.
But of course, now I have kind of, I've just managed to latch onto and then cling tightly to these working relationships, like with Drawn and Quarterly and now with the New Yorker. And it really comes down to just relationships with just a couple people. They're not like these big organizations, you know, like there's probably 3 or 4 people in total that I've ever worked with at the New Yorker and you know, and I'm still in touch with, and same thing with at Drawn and Quarterly. But you know, the experience of doing that illustration work, even if it was for something horrible that I hated, it's definitely on a continuum, and I don't know that I would be prepared to go through the process of doing a New Yorker cover if I didn't have that background.
So you mentioned Chris Oliveros, longtime publisher of Drawn and Quarterly, founder, I think, of Drawn and Quarterly.
Yeah.
You know, as a fan of alternative comics, whenever I started reading them, it was like there was Fantagraphics and Drawn and Quarterly were sort of the 2 big alternative comics publishers. Yeah. We have not talked to anybody too close to Drawn and Quarterly. So can you talk about that experience? What Chris was like, what it's been like working with them over the years, and I have follow-ups because I think that company has changed a lot in, say, it's certainly in 25 years. So any stories from when you first started working with them and what that was like?
Oh, yeah. I mean, more than we have time for, but I mean, at that, in those early years of Drawn and Quarterly, it was as small and independent as a legitimate publishing company could be. I mean, he was working out of the kitchen of his little apartment in Montreal. His partner was helping him out a little bit and kind of running the company with him. But there were no outside employees or anything like that. I think they were even just storing all the printed stuff in their apartment. I don't think they had a storage space or anything, fulfilling all the orders by hand. You know, I Chris is kind of retired as a publisher now. He's enjoying being a cartoonist again after all this time. But so it's sad for me that I'm not in contact with him as much as I used to. I used to be, you know, working with him I would normally be working with him very closely right now with a new book out. You know, when I was putting out the comics more regularly, we'd a couple times a year get into a zone where we were on the phone a lot about the production and the deadline and everything like that. And then I would see him. A lot of times we would get invited as Drawn and Quarterly to come to these festivals, or group events. Like there was a big one in LA, and then we went to Portugal and Holland, and he was always a part of that. So I spent a lot of time with him, even though we lived so far apart. And I still think of him as one of my best friends, which is not the relationship that every artist gets to have with their publisher. And you know, he kind of, for me, almost set an unfair standard of what a boss could be, of what a publisher could be. And you know, probably it's not even a good model in terms of how to be a business person, because there were many times where he prioritized aesthetics and getting something perfect over the bottom line. You know, there were definitely print runs that were completely just thrown out at his own expense because something was wrong, but maybe it was his fault or something like that. In addition to that commitment to getting things right, he also just had an amazing trust and belief in and admiration for the artists that he selected. You know, it's sometimes you read about filmmakers who say that like the way to be a great director is to be a good to cast well. You get the right actors and let them do their thing. And I think that was Chris's approach to publishing, was to find an artist that he respected and trusted, and then give them the freedom and do what you can to support their vision. And so that was just it was sort of like the dream scenario for me.
Were you able to go to him for feedback for, I mean, you were very, very young when you start working with him. I assume that you still had a lot of growing, took place. Was he somebody that would offer, I don't know, editorial feedback type of stuff?
Minimal, very minimal. He was really helpful and participatory in terms of the production and dealing with printers and sometimes with design choices, but really for the most part, quite hands off, and to me, just supportive. I mean, to me, I think of him as, there's sort of a long tradition of this in comics, but a fan who ended up becoming a business person or a publisher or a retailer or whatever like that. Sometimes those are very bad, very bad situations for business people, because they really are just fans. But I think that was what made it so special for me working there at that time, was because I felt like more than anything else, he was just a real fan of his artists.
One of the great books that came out of Drawn and Quarterly for me as a reader was Pushman and Other Stories, Yoshihiro Tatsumi. I believe you edited, lettered, designed the library, his books that Drawn and Quarterly printed, and that was something that I think you brought to Chris. Can you talk a little bit about that artist and how you found that artist, the impact he had on you as a reader, as an artist yourself?
And also, thank you for that.
Yes.
Oh, cool. I'm glad you guys liked it. Yeah. It was done totally for selfish reasons. I discovered Tatsumi's work around the same time that I discovered Love and Rockets and Neat Stuff and Lloyd Llewellyn, because there was one English edition of his work, kind of a big album-sized paperback, that was put out by a publisher that's long been out of business. And apparently that English edition was not even authorized, and Tatsumi himself did not know of its existence. Basically, what that publisher had done was bought a European translation, I think it was a Spanish edition, and translated that into English, and probably just reproduced the artwork off the European edition. But it was done just well enough that it really registered with me, and I could tell that there was something special about the stories. I knew I loved the artwork, but I also sensed like, this is really kind of a cool thing. These kind of dark urban short stories set in Japan. Like I loved everything about it. And I guess, when I discovered it, there was sort of a democratic quality to everything I discovered. Like I didn't know if, where Raw stood in the hierarchy compared to Love and Rockets or Tatsumi. It was just all stuff that I liked. And so over the years, I sort of learned more like, oh, okay, the Hernandez brothers are a big deal and Raw is a big deal. Has anybody ever heard of Tatsumi? And like, no, like I got no response to that. Like I never met other people who were fans or didn't read much about it or anything like that. And so I just sort of made it like a little personal quest to find more of this guy's art. I had some contacts in Japan, or if I knew someone who was going to be going over there, I would write down his name and say, if you can go to used bookstores and find anything by this guy. And I started getting a collection. I built up a stack of books, all in Japanese by Tatsumi, a lot of them from decades past. And I would just look at them and think like, this is so cool. I wish I knew what they were saying, because I am Japanese American, but I can't read or write Japanese. So it was sort of just like a purely visual thing. I would look at these editions, and I just got more and more obsessed with it. I would there was especially a certain era. I sort of figured out that for whatever reason, the work that he was doing in the late 60s, early 70s really appealed to me. And that was the stuff that I was most curious about. And so at some point, I can't even remember how I met this guy, but I met a guy who lived near me in Berkeley who was Japanese and who worked as a translator. And I paid him out of pocket to just do, to basically type up like Word documents translating the dialogue and the words from some of these Tatsumi stories for me. And so I was able to just read them. And it was just something I wanted to do just as a fan, to finally decode these mysterious stories. And I was very pleased that even in that clumsy way of trying to digest the work, it still really blew me away, and I got even more excited about it. And so not long after that, Chris Oliveros came to the Bay Area for some work-related thing, and I just put together an envelope of Xeroxes of some of the stories in Japanese, and then some of those original translations, and I just gave it to him, and I said, you know, I don't know if this will interest you at all. It's pretty different from the kind of stuff you've been publishing so far, but just take a look at it. And then he took it back to Montreal, and then almost immediately called me up and said, like, yeah, we gotta do this. Let's figure out how to get this professionally translated and how to get the rights. And, you know, we didn't know anything. I mean, we had no idea how to even get in touch with Tatsumi. We didn't know if he was alive. We didn't know what the legal, you know, roadblocks might be. So really, it was just the two of us sort of just like stumbling through the process, which I think now is pretty squared away. I think there's like a real path to getting the rights to foreign material and all that now. But we were just really kind of stumbling around in the dark.
That's a cool story. It's almost like a real life. It's a good life if you don't weaken.
Yeah. Yeah.
Such a pleasure too. Like reading the first Tatsumi stuff that I got my hands on from you guys was like, it gave me the same feeling that I had when I got into comics in the first place, or like at every evolution, when it's like when you go to independent comics and then you feel juiced up again. Like I felt that exact way after I read Pushman, and Drifting Life is huge for me.
I was going to say, like, what a body of work they end up publishing with him. You know, his memoirs, sort of his golden period, and then like Black Blizzard.
Oh
it's really a remarkable set of books that end up coming out of that.
Yeah, I got totally encouraged and enthused by the reaction that came from the first book. I sort of made a deal with Chris, like, let's just do one, and you know, if that's all I get, then I'm excited, and we'll just see what happens. And the response was really great, and in fact, we had him come to San Diego one year, and it was just, we went to LA and San Diego together, kind of a surreal experience for me to be just a part of that. But it was really, you know, I think it's sort of like a translator or an editor's dream to sit beside the person whose work that you brought over and just see this line of people like going down the hall in San Diego, and you know, people who had no interest in me, who had never bought another book by Drawn and Quarterly in the past. Some of these were like hardcore manga fans who had the special like boards with the gold edging that they wanted to bring to have him do his drawing on, and it was really incredible. He got to bring his wife with him, and she was completely blown away. Like I think she implied to me that she had never seen her husband as a success to that degree until they came to America.
Wow, that's fantastic.
That's one of the great discoveries, like going over to Japan, like the stuff that's popular, and, you know, they have a bigger industry than us, you know, times 5 or something. It's really for that shonen stuff for the most part. And the Gero cartoonists, it's kind of the Fantagraphics model where you don't get an advance, and, you know, you put your work in there and hopefully you get a trade and then make some royalties off of that. But the divide is huge. It's massive between the successful stuff and then like the Gekiga, more adult comics.
Yeah, when we finally got in touch with Tatsumi, he was essentially a used book dealer. He was still drawing, but he had no kind of notoriety or anything like that. When I went over there, kind of on a mission to convince him to do this deal and to meet with him face to face, I met with other people, other locals beforehand, and I would tell them what I was doing there. And when I said his name, it would sometimes be met with like, I think I remember that name, but it wasn't like, oh, great, you're gonna, I was surprised by, how underappreciated I think he was, and I think he had sort of resigned himself to being a used book dealer. He had a shop, and he sold a lot of old vintage manga and other books, but I think that's mainly what he was doing was being a bookseller.
When you went out there, was Drifting Life still being serialized in the Mandarake catalogs? Because that was like what they said to me. It was like probably his biggest platform, because that store is like one of the hugest
Yeah.
manga shops, and in the catalog, that's how Drifting Life was serialized.
Yeah.
As far as they told me. But was that going on when you were out there?
I don't know. I remember only hearing about that, about A Drifting Life, after we'd started publishing his work in English. So, I mean, it's such a massive book. Maybe he had already begun work on it, or something like that. But I didn't hear about it for a while, and we were really, really focused on getting the rights and doing the translation on that late 60s, early 70s stuff at the time. I mean, I think maybe even if we had heard about it, we couldn't even process it. Like if he said, well, I'm also working on this 700 page, we'd been like, okay, let's see if we can sell this first, slim volume. Let's not go crazy here.
All right, let's stay on Drawn and Quarterly for a minute. So they've undergone a lot of changes since Chris has retired. I believe Peggy Burns has taken over as publisher. Mm-hmm. You mentioned, a great production team. I think that's headed by Tom Devlin. First came on my radar when he was at High Water Books and was doing some really interesting things with production and design. Can you talk about how the dynamics have they changed for you? Are you sort of grandfathered in? And
I think so. I don't know who to give credit to for that. Maybe everyone just agreed that was a nice way to proceed or something. But the transition has been pretty seamless. I knew Peggy and Tom even when Chris was still the publisher there. They both were still working for Drawn and Quarterly for a number of years. I developed, particularly with Peggy, a pretty long working relationship because she was their publicist for a number of years. And so we worked pretty closely on promotion for when I had books coming out. There's, it's beyond that core team. There's also a lot of other people who are very important there. The person that I work with the most is named Tracy Hurren, and she is kind of like my all-purpose. I guess she's my editor, my co-designer, my production person, my proofreader. We just she's like the closest I have to a collaborator in any of this, and she has really made a lot of things possible that might not have otherwise been possible. I mean, for example, like getting a book like this with all these bells and whistles in terms of how it's bound and printed and everything, to get that done in any time would have been challenging and expensive. But for her to get it out into the world in the midst of a global pandemic was kind of a miraculous feat. I mean, we started printing, the production of this book actually began at a printing press in China, right as the first stages of the lockdown were happening. And so we had to withdraw it from there and leave China. And, we basically got chased around the globe by the virus lockdowns. And I think there's probably 20 times along that path where any other publisher or editor would have said, that's it. We're defeated by this. This is too big for us to try and fight. We're just going to have to do a little paperback, and it's just going to look like a normal book. And that's just the way it is. But she just didn't even really consider that as a possibility. And we both just stuck to our guns and really felt like, there's a reason behind all these design choices. It's not an arbitrary gimmick. And so we really pushed for it, and she made a lot of things happen that seemed, like nail-bitingly impossible. And then she would send an email. She's like, okay, they got it. They got the placeholder ribbon. It's like, oh my God.
Adrian, when you write your comics, is it a mixture of words and pictures, or do you use a lot of creative capital in just typing up movie scripts for yourself or something?
I used to almost be like I think it was so ingrained in me that Marvel kind of production line way of working, that even though I was doing it all myself, I still thought of like, well, now I'll be the writer and I'll type something up, and now I'll be the illustrator, or now I'll be the letterer. And I really separated all the jobs. And now I really try and integrate everything as much as possible. A lot of the reason that most of my books are either short or they're comprised of short chapters or segments is because I try and do as much of the writing, what's technically considered the writing, in my mind. Like, I don't like sit there and look at a blank piece of paper and say like, what is this comic about? And then, it's like, I'll formulate the idea, and I almost just try and develop it as like a little movie, or almost like a memory in my brain. And I turn it over for a long time. That's part of why it takes me so long to get books done, is because this kind of marinating process takes a long time. And I've found that it actually has noticeable, brings noticeable improvements to the final thing if I just let it sit and process subconsciously for a long time. So a lot of the writing is not sitting there with pen and paper, but it's me like pushing my kid on the swing at the park while my mind drifts, and I'm thinking, okay, now there was that scene that I wasn't quite sure how to figure out, and let me envision it in my mind. And I try and do that to such a degree that then when I race home and I have a little bit of time, I can just draw it.
Is that drawing a rough drawing? Are you just kind of like recording that down quickly and assembling it?
On what the project is. I mean, to be fair, like something like my previous book was a little more challenging for me in the pre-production. So there were more like drafts, but all of it in comics form, like there's no typewritten script, and then there's no like thumbnails or anything. It's just in like incrementally less primitive versions of what ends up being printed on the page.
Has your process evolved quite a bit over the years? I'm thinking stylistically of The Loneliness of the Long Distance Cartoonist. It feels like a long cry from some of the early optic nerves that were, I don't know if cinematic's the right word, but they were more modeled. There was a greater focus on maybe the illustration side of it.
Yeah.
Is that something that you consciously evolve and change maybe from story to story?
Yeah, I think when I started out, especially when I started working with Drawn and Quarterly, like the published issues of Optic Nerve, I was so consciously trying to distinguish myself from the other comics that were going to be on the rack near mine at the comic book store. And I was really, and I was also trying to distance myself from the types of comics that I think the average public at that point in history imagined when you said you were a cartoonist, And so I was very self-conscious and kind of rebellious and defiant. And so everything about it, from like the cover design to the color choices and I don't think it was a completely pure impulse. I think it was a little bit reactive, like trying to distance myself from something else, like identifying myself in opposition to something, which is kind of a stupid way to create art, I think, in hindsight. But and I think what's happened over the years is that I've become less like that, and I've been influenced. I have speed lines if someone was running. I wouldn't have like beads of sweat. All these things that I thought were too comic-y or something like that. I think there was write a novel, but saying like, I don't like to use commas or something like that. Like there were these things that were just part of the language that work beautifully and don't necessarily mean childish or genre or anything like that. They're neutral. And it took me a while to come to that. And so I think I've embraced that more in the last few books.
It's interesting to see that. It's almost the visual vernacular of cartooning, some of those pieces. And, I think in this new book, just the I hate to use words like simplify because I know that means something different to everybody, but the expressions of the characters are so vivid, you know, and they're almost like in focus as a result of being a more pared down style. It's a pleasure to look at.
Yeah, like the rhythm of it with the 6-panel grids, like really, it lulls you. It's hypnotic. It's hypnotic. Like you get sucked into that book amazingly, and also so much great nonverbal storytelling too. So it's like perfect use of words and pictures.
I appreciate hearing that from other cartoonists, because I think, you know, a lot of what I'm aiming for now is to have a style that's almost invisible. Like I wouldn't want, you know, the average person who hears an interview with me and orders the book, I don't want them to necessarily think like, oh, he paced this so thoughtfully, or you know, the movement from panel to panel works so beautifully, or any of that technical stuff. I want it to be invisible and hopefully just lead to an easier time of processing the material. But of course, it means a lot to me when someone who picks up on that stuff notices, because a lot of thought does go into making something easily readable.
Yeah, I often think about Jason, the cartoonist, and he seems to be great at that, of really not having anything extra in the drawing or in his cartooning, but also not missing anything. You know,
Right.
It's like a reading experience. He's able to do action and emotion and all this stuff, and it just looks effortless. It's
Yeah.
kind of like it's really the magic of comics, I think,
Right.
in a lot of ways. A beautiful thing to behold, though.
And with everything you just said, Adrian, even the lettering of the strips gives a lot of air. It looks very inviting. It doesn't seem like a slog. Like you know, that tiny, tight lettering sometimes when you got to pull out that magnifying glass.
Yeah, we're getting older.
Yeah. Adrian, before we get out of here, can you tell us any stories from that comic book cruise that didn't make it into the final book?
I know that could be a whole book unto itself. I mean, let me think. Well, you know, as I described in the book, I was 100% the least of the attractions. You know, I mean, there was Neil Gaiman and Frank Miller.
Adrian, how should we sell this to the people who don't know? Like, this is the height of the .com era, and money was flowing. And some website, was it Newsarama or something?
I can't remember. I can't remember who was in charge of it.
It might have been CBLDF.
Yes, I think it was.
They got a hold of some .com money.
I don't know how it happened, but I do remember the Comics Journal ran an interview, and it was like everybody's spouse or partner, I think, basically talking about the cartoonist, which is, I think that's after the Journal had kind of jumped the shark. That might have been the jump the shark.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I think it was designed as a fundraiser for the CBLDF, and what you could do is any organization could book a portion of one of these cruise ships, and then they would sell the tickets for and get their guests and everything like that. So we didn't even take over the entire cruise ship. There were other theme cruises happening at the time, in addition to ours. So once again, you know, it was just that stereotypical thing of like, there's all the beautiful, healthy, wealthy people over there enjoying their business-related cruise or whatever, and then over in the corner, here's all us comics guys, like, you know, wearing long pants and shirts while we're sitting next to the swimming pool. And but so yeah, they tried to get a very wide-ranging roster of guest artists, and they got some huge names like Neil Gaiman and Frank Miller, and you know, I think they just felt like let's try and maybe we'll be able to get a few alternative fans or something like that. So they put me on there. But yeah, it was very strange for us all to be trapped on a boat together for a week, occasionally stopping at some tourist port in Mexico, and we like wander off and like look around for a little bit and then get ushered back on the boat. And, you know, like no real privacy. The rule was just that, like, unless you were in your cabin, you were sort of fair game for the people who'd purchased tickets. So I had experiences of like sitting there playing chess with a friend and looking up, and people were standing there with cameras to take a picture. And, you know, I had, as I show in the book, every night at dinner, I had to be rotated to a different table of fans. And it was up to me to sort of lead the conversation. And every night, people would almost break down in tears when they got their assignment and saw that they weren't at Neil Gaiman's table and they had to endure a meal with me. And God, I'm trying to think what else. I mean, Neil Adams was on the cruise as a guest too, and he used it as an opportunity to give a seminar on, I can't remember if it was either flat Earth or
the expanding Earth theory that the bodies of water are
yeah.
making the Earth. Like I thought he was going to take you to the hollow part at the top or something.
Yeah, how did you know that, Ed?
Oh, he's famous for that stuff.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's what it was. It was the expanding Earth thing. And so we all crowded into one of the little conference rooms below deck on this thing, and he had his PowerPoint and he gave his talk. And there was a couple who were there on their honeymoon. That's what they decided to do on their honeymoon. And I believe it was the bride in that couple won Neil Gaiman's leather jacket in an auction and then had an asthma attack because she was so excited. And then, you know, Neil Gaiman kind of came to her rescue. And I remember him like saying like, does anybody have a breathalyzer or whatever it is? And kind of saved her life there and gave her his leather jacket. And and then just all of us who were used to seeing each other in our usual outfits shuffling around in San Diego at the convention center or something, were forced to like go out on beaches. And so you'd look up and you'd see, I don't even want to say who it was, but you'd see a known cartoonist in a little swimsuit doing parasailing or something like that. You know?
That has to be Chris Ware, right?
Over the years, I've seen some photos from there, man. I've seen some Hawaiian trunks in my day from that excursion.
They definitely should have had a documentary crew there recording the whole thing because it was truly unbelievable.
What a concept!
Yeah,
I'm good if you are, Jimmy.
Yes.
All right, so the new book, The Loneliness of the Long Distance Cartoonist, in stores now?
Yes.
Oh man, I'm sure you don't need our help, man, but we're gonna sell you a couple copies just from this interview.
Thank you. Thank
Adrian,
you so much.
where's a good place for people to follow you? I know I follow you on Instagram. What's your Instagram?
Yeah, it's just my name, Adrian Tomine. I also have a website that has a lot of my illustrations and things like that on it. And that's about it. If you see someone on Twitter or Facebook that purports to be me, it's not.
Smart man.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Adrian. This has been a pleasure.
Oh, totally. It's been such a blast for me. I love talking to other cartoonists. That's who this book was really created for. And so hearing your response to it is kind of like the most important one.
I think we have a lot of cartoonists in our audience too, so I would definitely recommend the book to them. I had a great time reading it. A lot of stuff. I do wonder how a civilian will relate to some of those stories.
I don't know.
But from a cartoonist standpoint, it was just a blast.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I appreciate it so much, and I enjoy your show, and I'm glad I got to be a part of it.
Take care, Adrian.
Okay. Bye, guys.
See you.